The gymnasium fell dead silent. 300 soldiers, their dress blues crisp and medals gleaming, stared at the stage where my brother Marcus lay motionless. The ceremony that was supposed to celebrate his promotion to lieutenant colonel had turned into something else entirely. As the base commander frantically called for a medic, I found myself pushing through the crowd, my hands already moving toward the small leather pouch I always carried. The same pouch Marcus had mocked just 6 months earlier, calling my hobby weird voodoo nonsense that would never amount to anything useful. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. If only he could see himself now. Growing up in suburban Phoenix, Marcus and I couldn't have been more different. He was the golden child, star quarterback at Roosevelt High, valedictorian, full ride to West Point. Everything he touched turned to success, and everyone knew Marcus Brennan was destined for greatness. Me? I was the quiet younger brother who spent his afternoons in the backyard, hunched over books that most people would consider strange. While Marcus was throwing perfect spirals and charming college recruiters, I was studying the ancient art of acupuncture. It started innocently enough when I was 15. Our neighbor, Mrs. Chen, an elderly Chinese woman who'd immigrated decades earlier, noticed me struggling with chronic headaches that kept me out of school for days at a time. The doctors had run every test imaginable, prescribed medication after medication, but nothing worked. "Come," she said one afternoon as I sat on our front porch, pressing my palms against my temples. "I show you something." Mrs. Chen led me into her living room, walls lined with books written in characters I couldn't read. She gestured for me to sit in her worn leather chair, then disappeared into the back room. When she returned, she carried a small wooden box and wore an expression of complete focus I'd never seen before. "This very old medicine," she explained, opening the box to reveal dozens of thin silver needles. "Older than your country, you trust me?" I was desperate enough to trust anyone at that point. The headaches had stolen months of my life, turning me into a shadow of who I wanted to be. So I nodded, and Mrs. Chen began placing needles in specific points along my scalp, my hands, even my feet. The process was surprisingly painless, and within 20 minutes, something miraculous happened. The crushing pressure that had lived behind my eyes for months simply disappeared. "How?" I whispered, afraid that speaking too loudly might bring the pain rushing back. Mrs. Chen smiled, her weathered hands carefully removing each needle. "Body has map. Everything connected. You learn to read map, you help body heal itself." That afternoon changed everything. Mrs. Chen agreed to teach me, but only if I promised to take it seriously. This wasn't a game or a quick fix. It was a discipline that required years of study, practice, and respect for traditions that stretched back thousands of years. Marcus, home on leave from his sophomore year at West Point, found me in Mrs. Chen's living room 3 days later. I was practicing needle placement on a practice pad, trying to memorize the exact locations of meridian points. "What the hell is this?" he asked, his voice carrying that particular tone of amusement and disdain he reserved for things he considered beneath him. "Acupuncture," I replied without looking up. "I'm learning how to help people heal." Marcus laughed, not a kind laugh, but the sharp bark he used when he encountered something he thought was ridiculous. "Seriously, Jake? You're playing with needles and pretending it's medicine? This is some weird voodoo nonsense." "It's not voodoo," I said quietly. "It's a medical practice that's been helping people for thousands of years." "Right?" Marcus picked up one of my textbooks, flipping through pages covered with meridian charts and pressure point diagrams. "And I suppose you think sticking people with these tiny needles is going to cure cancer or something? It's not about curing everything. It's about understanding how the body's energy flows and helping to restore balance when..." "Energy flows?" Marcus's laugh grew louder. "Jake, come on. You're 17 years old. You could be doing normal teenage stuff, maybe even trying to get good enough at something to earn a scholarship like I did. Instead, you're sitting in our neighbor's living room playing witch doctor." The words stung because they came from someone whose opinion had always mattered to me. Marcus wasn't just my older brother, he was my hero. Seeing him dismiss something that had literally changed my life felt like a punch to the gut. "Mrs. Chen isn't a witch doctor," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "She's helped more people in this neighborhood than you know. Mrs. Chen is a sweet old lady who's convinced you that her folk remedies are real medicine. There's a difference, Jake. Real medicine happens in hospitals, with doctors who went to medical school, using treatments that have been scientifically proven to work." I looked down at the needle in my hands, remembering how those same folk remedies had given me my life back when real medicine had failed me completely. But I didn't argue further. Marcus was home for only a few days, and I didn't want to spend them fighting. Over the next 4 years, as Marcus climbed the ranks at West Point and I dove deeper into my studies with Mrs. Chen, the dynamic between us never really changed. He'd come home for holidays and leaves, full of stories about military strategy, leadership challenges, and the incredible future that awaited him as an Army officer. I'd listen with genuine admiration. Marcus really was brilliant, and his passion for serving his country was infectious. But whenever the conversation turned to what I was doing, the same dismissive attitude would surface. By the time I was a senior in high school, I'd become quite skilled. Mrs. Chen had introduced me to other practitioners in the area, and I'd even started helping some of their patients. Word spread quietly through certain circles that there was a young man who had real talent for the ancient healing arts. "You know what you should do with your life, Jake?" Marcus said during his final leave before graduation from West Point. We were sitting in our childhood bedroom, him polishing his dress shoes while I reviewed notes on ear acupuncture techniques. "You should consider the military. Not everyone's cut out for combat roles, but the Army needs medics, administrative personnel, support staff. You could actually make a difference instead of—" He gestured vaguely toward my books. "Whatever this is." "I am making a difference," I replied. "Mrs. Patterson's arthritis hasn't flared up in 6 months because of the treatments I've been giving her. Mr. Rodriguez finally got a full night's sleep for the first time in years after we worked on his insomnia points. This helps people, Marcus." "Placebo effect," he said with the confidence of someone who'd taken a few psychology courses. "These people feel better because they believe you're helping them, not because sticking needles in their skin actually does anything medical." I wanted to tell him about the research studies, the growing acceptance of acupuncture in mainstream medicine, the thousands of patients whose lives had been improved by treatments that had nothing to do with placebo effects. But Marcus had already made up his mind, and I'd learned that trying to change it was futile. After he graduated from West Point and received his commission as a second lieutenant, our conversations became even more sporadic. He was stationed at Fort Benning, then Fort Campbell, always busy with training exercises, leadership responsibilities, and the demanding schedule of a young officer trying to prove himself. When we did talk, it was usually about his career progression, his soldiers, or the various deployments he was preparing for. I, meanwhile, had enrolled in a formal acupuncture program after high school. It was intensive. 3 years of study covering traditional Chinese medicine theory, anatomy, physiology, and hundreds of hours of supervised clinical practice. Mrs. Chen had given me an incredible foundation, but I wanted the credentials and deeper knowledge that would let me help even more people. The few times Marcus learned about my continued pursuit of acupuncture, his reaction remained consistent. During a brief phone call, when I was halfway through my program, I mentioned that I'd been selected to assist with a research study at a local hospital, examining the effectiveness of acupuncture for chronic pain management in cancer patients. "Wait, you're still doing the needle thing?" he asked, and I could hear the surprise in his voice. "I thought that was just a phase you were going through in high school." "It's not a phase, Marcus. It's my career. I'm going to be a licensed acupuncturist." A long pause. "Jake, I don't understand. You're smart enough to do anything you want. You could go to medical school, become a real doctor. Why are you wasting your potential on this alternative stuff?" The word, alternative, carried the same dismissive weight as weird voodoo nonsense had years earlier. I realized that in Marcus's mind, anything that didn't fit into his narrow definition of legitimate medicine was automatically suspect. Because this works, I said simply. Because I've seen it help people when nothing else could. Because it's what I'm meant to do. If you say so, Marcus replied, but his tone suggested he thought I was deluding myself. That conversation happened just 2 weeks before Marcus received the news that would change everything. His selection for a rapid promotion to lieutenant colonel, a recognition of his exceptional leadership during his recent deployment to Afghanistan. The promotion ceremony was scheduled for November 15th at Fort Carson, where he'd been transferred to take command of a battalion. The invitation arrived on thick cream-colored cardstock with the official Fort Carson letterhead embossed in gold. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Brennan's promotion ceremony would take place in the main auditorium, with full military honors. At the bottom, in Marcus's familiar handwriting, he'd added a personal note. "Jake, hope you can make it. It would mean a lot to have a family there, M." A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I stared at that note for a long time. It was the first indication in years that Marcus actually valued my presence at his important moments. Despite our philosophical differences about my career choices, he was still my brother, and his success genuinely made me proud. I called him that evening to confirm I'd be there. "Really? You can get the time off from your practice?" There was still that slight hesitation when he talked about my work, like he wasn't quite sure how to categorize what I did. "I can arrange my schedule," I assured him. "Congratulations, by the way, Lieutenant Colonel at 32 is incredible." "Thanks." His voice carried a mixture of pride and humility that reminded me of the brother I'd grown up admiring. It still doesn't feel real. 300 soldiers under my command, responsibility for a whole battalion. Sometimes I wonder if they made a mistake. "They didn't make a mistake, Marcus. You've earned this." The ceremony was scheduled for a Saturday morning, which meant I'd need to drive up to Colorado Springs on Friday evening. As I packed for the trip, I automatically reached for my professional kit, a leather case containing my acupuncture needles, moxa, and various tools I'd accumulated over the years. It was habit at this point. I took the kit with me everywhere, the same way Marcus probably never traveled without his service pistol. I paused, my hand on the case's worn handle. Marcus's words from years ago echoed in my memory, weird voodoo nonsense that would never amount to anything useful. For a moment I considered leaving the kit at home. This was Marcus's day, a military celebration. There was no reason to bring reminders of the thing that had always stood between us. But then I thought of Mrs. Chen's first lesson. Always be ready to help. You never know when someone needs what you can give. I slipped the kit into my travel bag. The drive to Colorado took me through some of the most beautiful landscape in the country. As I climbed into the mountains, leaving the desert behind for pine forests and snow-capped peaks, I found myself thinking about the path that had led me to this point. 3 years after completing my acupuncture program, I had a thriving practice in Tucson. My patients ranged from construction workers with chronic back pain to cancer survivors dealing with the side effects of chemotherapy. Word had spread organically. One successful treatment leading to referrals, one life improved opening doors to help others. The validation I'd been seeking from Marcus had eventually come from somewhere else entirely. The people whose pain I could ease, whose sleep I could restore, whose quality of life I could improve. It didn't matter that my older brother thought I was practicing alternative medicine. What mattered was that it worked. Fort Carson was impressive in a way that made me understand why Marcus had fallen in love with military life. The entire base radiated purpose and precision, from the perfectly maintained buildings to the soldiers who moved with confident efficiency. Everything had its place, everyone had their role, and the whole system functioned like a well-oiled machine. I checked into a hotel in Colorado Springs Friday night, then met Marcus for dinner at a restaurant near the base. He looked good. The responsibility of command suited him. His uniform was immaculate, his posture straight, and when he talked about his soldiers, his face lit up with genuine affection and pride. "There's this kid, Private Williams," he said over dessert, 19 years old, joined up straight out of high school in rural Alabama. Barely passed his physical fitness tests and basic training, but he's got this incredible work ethic. I've been mentoring him personally, and last month he scored expert marksman. The transformation has been amazing to watch. This was the Marcus I remembered from childhood, passionate about helping others succeed, naturally gifted at bringing out the best in people. The military had given him a perfect outlet for those talents. "You sound like you were born to do this," I told him, and I meant it. "Sometimes it feels that way," he paused, studying his coffee cup. "Jake, I need to tell you something. I know I haven't always been supportive of your career choices. I still don't really understand what you do, but I can see that you're happy. And successful. Mom mentioned that you're booked solid for months in advance." It wasn't exactly an apology, but from Marcus it was significant progress. "I am happy," I said simply. "Good. That's what matters." He raised his coffee cup in a small toast. "To doing what we love, even if we don't understand each other's paths." I clinked my cup against his, feeling a warmth I hadn't experienced with my brother in years. Maybe we could find a way to bridge the gap that had grown between us. The next morning, I arrived at Fort Carson early, wanting to find a good seat for the ceremony. The auditorium was already buzzing with activity. Soldiers in dress uniforms greeting family members, officers reviewing last-minute details, photographers setting up equipment. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation and pride. Marcus's battalion was impressive. 300 soldiers, representing the best of what the Army had to offer. They filed into the auditorium with military precision, taking their seats in perfect formation. Family members filled the remaining chairs, spouses, parents, children, all there to witness this moment of recognition for their loved one. The ceremony itself was beautiful in its formality and tradition. The base commander spoke about Marcus's distinguished service record, his leadership during deployment, and the qualities that made him an exceptional officer. When Marcus stepped forward to accept his new rank insignia, the pride on his face was unmistakable. But then something went wrong. As the base commander was pinning the lieutenant colonel insignia on Marcus's collar, I noticed my brother's face had gone pale. He was still standing at attention, but there was a slight tremor in his hands that I recognized from my medical training. His breathing had become shallow and rapid. The ceremony continued around him. The base commander finished with the insignia and stepped back to salute the newly promoted lieutenant colonel. Marcus raised his hand to return the salute, but the motion was unsteady. Sweat had broken out on his forehead despite the cool temperature in the auditorium. Then, without warning, Marcus collapsed. The silence that followed was deafening. 300 soldiers watched in shock as their new commanding officer crumpled to the stage floor, his body convulsing slightly before going completely still. The base commander immediately dropped to his knees beside Marcus, checking for a pulse while shouting for someone to call for medical assistance. "Is there a doctor in the house?" someone yelled from the stage. That's when training took over. I was out of my seat and moving toward the stage before I'd even consciously decided to act, my mind already analyzing what I'd observed. Marcus's symptoms, the pallor, tremor, rapid breathing, sudden collapse, suggested several possible causes, but combined with the high-stress environment and the fact that he'd mentioned working 18-hour days preparing for this ceremony, I had a strong suspicion about what was happening. I pushed through the crowd of stunned family members and concerned soldiers, my professional instincts overriding years of social conditioning that had taught me to stay in the background. As I reached the stage, the base commander looked up at me with desperate eyes. "Are you medical personnel?" he demanded. "I'm a licensed acupuncturist," I replied, already kneeling beside Marcus. "I have medical training." The commander's face showed confusion, but before he could respond, Marcus convulsed again. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and his pulse was erratic and weak. I pressed my fingers to specific points along his neck and wrist, feeling for the subtle signs that Western medicine might miss, but that traditional Chinese medicine recognized as critical indicators. "The base medics are 5 minutes out," someone shouted from the wings. 5 minutes might be too long. Whatever was happening to Marcus was escalating rapidly, and I could see in his face that he was slipping away from us. The crowd of 300 soldiers watched in absolute silence as their new commanding officer fought for his life on the stage where he'd just been honored. I opened my leather kit, the same one Marcus had mocked so many times, and selected several needles. My hands moved with practiced precision, finding the points I needed through Marcus's dress uniform. But this wasn't going to be a standard treatment. The formal military setting, the urgency of the situation, and the audience of skeptical soldiers created complications I'd never faced before. "What are you doing?" the base commander asked, his voice tight with stress. "His nervous system is in complete dysfunction," I explained while working. "There are specific points that can help regulate his heart rhythm and restore proper circulation. I need to stimulate the Shenmen point, the Yin Tang, and several others along the governing vessel meridian." The medical terminology seemed to reassure him slightly, but I could see doubt flickering in his eyes. Around us, the murmur of 300 voices created a low buzz of concern and confusion. Some of the soldiers had pulled out their phones to record what was happening, though whether they thought they were documenting a miracle or a disaster, I couldn't tell. As I inserted the first needle into the point between Marcus's eyebrows, his breathing changed subtly. It was still shallow, but the desperate gasping quality began to ease. The second needle went into his left ear, targeting the autonomic nervous system regulation point that Mrs. Chen had taught me years ago during my first lessons in treating acute stress responses. "Sir, what exactly is your brother doing?" I heard a young soldier ask another officer near the stage. The question carried a mixture of fascination and concern that seemed to echo through the entire auditorium. Marcus's pulse was stabilizing, but he was still unconscious. I needed to access points along his spine, but his dress uniform jacket made that impossible. Without hesitation, I began loosening his collar and carefully positioning needles along his neck and shoulders, working around the formal military decorations that represented years of distinguished service. Then something remarkable happened. Marcus's eyes fluttered open. He was disoriented, confused about where he was and why he was lying on the floor surrounded by hundreds of people. But he was conscious, and his color was returning to normal. The crisis had passed. "What happened?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "You collapsed during the ceremony," I told him quietly. "Try to stay still for a few more minutes." Marcus's gaze fell on the needles protruding from various points on his head and neck, and even in his weakened state, I saw the familiar expression of bewilderment cross his face. But this time, it wasn't accompanied by mockery or dismissal. This time, it was pure confusion mixed with something that might have been gratitude. The base medics arrived with a stretcher and full emergency equipment, but by then, Marcus was sitting up on his own, looking embarrassed more than anything else. The lead medic, a seasoned master sergeant with 20 years of experience, checked Marcus's vital signs and looked at me with genuine curiosity. "What did you do?" he asked. "His pulse is strong now, blood pressure's normal, and his coloring is good. When we got the call 5 minutes ago, they said he was unconscious and possibly going into cardiac arrest." "Acupuncture," I replied, beginning to remove the needles. He was experiencing what we call qi stagnation. Essentially, his body's energy systems became completely blocked under extreme stress. The needles helped restore proper flow and balance. The medic frowned, not in dismissal but in thoughtful consideration. "I've heard of acupuncture being used for pain management and addiction treatment, but never for acute medical emergencies. Traditional Chinese medicine has protocols for almost every kind of health crisis," I explained. "The key is recognizing the patterns and knowing which points to stimulate." As I finished removing the needles and packed them back into my kit, the auditorium remained eerily quiet. 300 soldiers had just witnessed something that didn't fit into their understanding of how medicine worked. Their commanding officer had collapsed during the most important moment of his career, and he'd been revived not by CPR or emergency drugs, but by his younger brother sticking thin needles into specific points on his body. Marcus struggled to his feet, waving off the medic's attempts to help him onto the stretcher. "I feel fine now," he insisted. "Really, whatever Jake did, it worked." The base commander approached us, his expression a mixture of relief and bewilderment. "Lieutenant Colonel Brennan, I think we should postpone the rest of the ceremony and get you to the base hospital for a full evaluation." "Sir, I understand your concern, but I honestly feel completely normal now." Marcus looked at me, then at the leather kit in my hands. "My brother, he's apparently better at this than I ever realized." A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the audience, breaking some of the tension that had gripped the auditorium, but the underlying amazement remained. These soldiers had witnessed something that challenged their assumptions about what was possible, about what constituted real medicine, about the effectiveness of treatments that fell outside conventional Western practices. The ceremony was indeed postponed, but not before the base commander made an announcement that surprised everyone, including me. Ladies and gentlemen, what we've just witnessed demonstrates the importance of having diverse skills and knowledge within our military family, he said, his voice carrying across the silent auditorium. Mr. Brennan's quick thinking and expertise potentially saved his brother's life today. This is a reminder that strength comes in many forms, and that we should never underestimate the value of unconventional approaches to problem solving. The applause that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. 300 soldiers, people trained to value precision, discipline, and proven methods, were applauding a treatment that most of them had probably never heard of before today. More importantly, they were applauding something that had actually worked when it mattered most. As we made our way out of the auditorium, Marcus walked beside me in contemplative silence. The base hospital wanted to observe him for a few hours as a precaution, but his vital signs remained stable, and he showed no residual effects from whatever had caused his collapse. "Jake," he said as we reached the medical facility, "I owe you an apology, a big one." "You don't owe me anything," I replied. "You're my brother." "No, I do. All these years I've been dismissing what you do as some kind of… I don't even know what I thought it was. But what happened back there?" He shook his head in amazement. "That was real medicine. You saved my life with those needles." It was the first time Marcus had ever used the word medicine to describe acupuncture without quotation marks or qualifiers. Coming from him, someone whose opinion had shaped so much of my self-doubt over the years, it meant more than he could possibly know. "What do you think caused the collapse?" I asked, shifting the focus away from the praise that still felt uncomfortable. "Stress, probably. I've been working 18-hour days for months, barely sleeping, living on coffee and adrenaline. My body finally said enough." He paused. "The weird thing is, I feel better now than I have in weeks. Not just physically, but mentally, like something that was wound too tight inside me finally loosened up." Word spread through Fort Carson faster than wildfire. By the time we left the base hospital that evening, soldiers throughout the installation had heard some version of what happened during the promotion ceremony. The story grew, with each telling the lieutenant colonel who collapsed on stage, the civilian brother who saved him with ancient needles, the 300 witnesses who saw something that defied their understanding of emergency medicine. Marcus was cleared by the base physicians after 6 hours of observation. They found nothing wrong with him beyond severe exhaustion and dehydration, exactly what I'd suspected. But what surprised me was the number of medical staff who approached me during his stay, asking detailed questions about acupuncture techniques and treatment protocols. "Dr. Martinez wants to know if you'd be willing to speak with some of our medical personnel tomorrow," Marcus told me as we walked to the parking lot. Apparently, half the base hospital staff has been researching acupuncture online since this afternoon. The idea of presenting to military medical professionals was both thrilling and terrifying. These were people trained in evidence-based Western medicine, accustomed to treatments that could be measured, quantified, and replicated under controlled conditions. What would they think of meridian theory and chi flow patterns? "I'm not sure I'm qualified to teach military doctors," I admitted. "Jake, you just saved someone's life in front of 300 people using methods that none of them understood. I think you're more qualified than you realize." That night, back at my hotel, I received a call from Dr. Elena Martinez, the chief of emergency medicine at the base hospital. Her voice was professional but curious, carrying the tone of someone genuinely interested in learning rather than debunking. "Mr. Brennan, I've been practicing emergency medicine for 15 years, and I've never seen anything quite like what happened today. Your brother's vital signs were genuinely unstable when our medics first assessed him, but by the time they arrived on scene, he was completely stable. I'm hoping you might be willing to share some insights about your intervention." We arranged to meet the following morning. Dr. Martinez had assembled a small group of medical staff, emergency physicians, nurses, a psychiatrist who specialized in trauma response, and a physical therapist who'd been exploring complementary medicine approaches for wounded veterans. The meeting took place in a conference room at the base hospital, and I'd never felt more nervous in my professional life. These were people whose medical training far exceeded mine in terms of conventional credentials. But as I began explaining the theoretical framework behind what I'd done for Marcus, something interesting happened. They didn't dismiss it out of hand. So when you identified what you called chi stagnation, Dr. Martinez asked, what specific physiological responses were you observing? His pulse was erratic and thready, skin pallor indicated poor circulation, the tremor suggested autonomic nervous system dysregulation, and his breathing pattern showed he was heading toward respiratory distress. In traditional Chinese medicine, we'd say his governing vessel meridian was blocked, preventing proper energy circulation throughout his body. The psychiatrist, Dr. James Liu, leaned forward with interest. That's fascinating. What you're describing sounds very similar to what we see in acute stress reactions. The sympathetic nervous system becomes overactivated, leading to exactly the symptoms you mentioned. The difference is terminology and treatment approach. Exactly, I agreed. Western medicine might treat those symptoms with medication to regulate heart rhythm or breathing, while TCM uses needle stimulation to restore the body's natural regulatory mechanisms. The physical therapist, Captain Sarah Thompson, had been taking detailed notes. We've been experimenting with acupuncture for chronic pain management with some of our wounded veterans, but we've never considered it for acute medical situations. The results we've seen for chronic conditions have been impressive enough that we're always looking for ways to expand its applications. What struck me most about the conversation was their genuine openness to learning. These weren't skeptics looking to poke holes in alternative medicine. They were healthcare professionals who'd witnessed something that worked and wanted to understand how to potentially integrate it into their practice. Would you be willing to conduct a training session for our emergency response team? Dr. Martinez asked toward the end of our meeting. Not to replace conventional protocols, but to provide additional tools that might be helpful in specific situations. I agreed, though I insisted on bringing in one of my more experienced colleagues from Denver who had additional certification in emergency acupuncture protocols. The training session was scheduled for the following weekend, giving me time to prepare materials and coordinate with Dr. Patricia Wong, a practitioner who'd been working with first responders in Colorado for over a decade. The news of the training session spread throughout the base, and what was originally planned as a small workshop for emergency staff grew into something much larger. Soldiers from Marcus's battalion began requesting permission to attend, along with medical personnel from other units and even some family members who'd witnessed the ceremony. Marcus, meanwhile, was dealing with his own unexpected aftermath from the incident. The video footage that several soldiers had taken during his collapse and recovery had somehow made its way onto social media, where it was generating intense discussion about alternative medicine, military healthcare, and the integration of traditional healing practices with modern emergency response. I've gotten calls from reporters, medical journals, and something called the Army Times. He told me over dinner that week. They all want to interview the miracle colonel and his needle-wielding brother. The public affairs office at Fort Carson doesn't quite know how to handle the attention. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Marcus, who'd spent years dismissing my career as irrelevant, had become inadvertently famous as living proof of its effectiveness. The brother who'd called acupuncture weird voodoo nonsense was now fielding interview requests specifically because that same treatment had saved his life. How are you handling all this? I asked. The attention, I mean, and the fact that everyone's suddenly interested in something you used to think was ridiculous? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at his coffee cup. When he looked up, his expression was more thoughtful than I'd ever seen it. Honestly? It's been humbling. Really humbling. All my life, I've prided myself on being rational, evidence-based, skeptical of anything that couldn't be proven through conventional means. Then I collapse in front of 300 people, and the thing that saves me is something I spent years making fun of. He paused, running his hand through his hair in a gesture I remembered from childhood whenever he was struggling with a difficult concept. But more than that, Jake, I'm starting to realize how narrow my definition of real medicine has been. I've been in combat zones where soldiers have been helped by all kinds of treatments, some conventional, some not so conventional. I've seen medics use whatever worked to keep people alive, regardless of whether it fit into standard protocols. But somehow, I never made the connection to what you do. The weekend training session exceeded everyone's expectations. Nearly 200 people attended, including soldiers, medical staff, family members, and several civilian first responders from Colorado Springs who'd heard about the event. Dr. Wong and I had prepared for maybe 30 participants, but the base gymnasium was packed. We covered basic acupuncture theory, demonstrated simple techniques for managing acute stress and pain, and discussed when and how these methods might complement conventional emergency care. But the most powerful part of the session came when Marcus stood up to address the crowd. 6 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be endorsing acupuncture training for military personnel, I'd have recommended they get a psychiatric evaluation, he began, drawing laughter from the audience. But what happened during my promotion ceremony taught me something important about keeping an open mind and recognizing expertise wherever it comes from. Marcus's words to that packed gymnasium marked a turning point that neither of us could have anticipated. As he continued his impromptu speech, describing how his perspective had shifted from skepticism to respect, I watched something remarkable happen in the faces of the audience. Soldiers who'd probably never heard of acupuncture before that week were nodding in understanding, genuinely engaged with concepts that would have seemed foreign just days earlier. "The thing is," Marcus continued, "my brother didn't just save my life that day. He showed all of us that real expertise can come in forms we don't expect, from sources we might overlook if we're not careful. In the military, we talk a lot about adapting to changing conditions and using every available resource. Well, turns out my little brother has been developing resources I didn't even know existed." The applause that followed was different from the polite acknowledgement typical of military presentations. This was genuine appreciation, the kind that comes when people realize they've learned something that might actually matter in their lives. After the session, something unprecedented happened. Dr. Wong and I found ourselves surrounded by soldiers asking specific questions about treatments for their own health issues. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez wanted to know if acupuncture could help with the chronic shoulder pain he'd been dealing with since an injury in Afghanistan. Private First Class Kim asked about insomnia treatments that didn't involve prescription medications. Captain Williams inquired whether we could help her husband, a veteran struggling with phantom limb pain from an IED blast. What struck me most was the quality of their questions. These weren't people looking for miracle cures or dismissing conventional medicine. They were individuals who'd exhausted traditional treatment options and were genuinely curious about alternatives that might provide relief. "This is exactly what we hoped would happen," Dr. Martinez told me as we watched soldiers scheduling appointments with Dr. Wong for follow-up consultations. Integration, not replacement. Adding tools to the toolkit rather than throwing out everything we know. Over the following months, the program that had started as an emergency training session evolved into something much more comprehensive. Fort Carson became a pilot site for integrating complementary medicine approaches into military healthcare, with acupuncture as the cornerstone, but expanding to include other traditional healing practices. Marcus and I maintained regular contact throughout this period, our relationship fundamentally changed by what had happened during his promotion ceremony. The brother who'd once mocked my weird hobby became one of my most effective advocates, using his position and credibility to open doors that might have remained closed to someone without military connections. "I got a call from the Pentagon yesterday," he told me during one of our weekly phone conversations. "They're interested in expanding the Fort Carson program to other installations. Apparently, the preliminary results are impressive enough that they want to see if it can be scaled up." The results were indeed impressive. Emergency room visits for anxiety-related issues had dropped by 30% among personnel who'd participated in the acupuncture program. Chronic pain management showed significant improvement, with many soldiers reducing their reliance on prescription painkillers. Perhaps most importantly, overall morale and stress management scores had improved across participating units. But the changes went beyond statistics. Marcus began sharing stories from his battalion that illustrated the human impact of what we'd started. "Remember Private Williams, the kid from Alabama I mentioned?" he said during one conversation. "He's been struggling with panic attacks since his deployment ended, couldn't sleep, was having trouble focusing on his duties. 3 sessions with Dr. Wong, and he's like a different person. Not just better, stronger, more confident. It's like the treatment didn't just address his symptoms, it gave him tools to manage stress in general." These stories multiplied across the base. Soldiers who'd been skeptical initially became some of the program's strongest supporters once they experienced results firsthand. The cultural shift was remarkable. A military installation known for its adherence to conventional approaches had embraced something that challenged traditional medical paradigms. The success at Fort Carson attracted attention from medical researchers, leading to formal studies that would provide the scientific validation Marcus had always insisted was necessary. Dr. Martinez partnered with researchers from the University of Colorado to conduct controlled trials examining the effectiveness of acupuncture in military healthcare settings. "You know what's funny?" Marcus said when the first peer-reviewed paper was published, showing statistically significant benefits from the program. "I spent years telling you that your work wasn't real medicine because it lacked scientific evidence. Now we have the evidence, published in a mainstream medical journal, and it proves what you've been telling me all along." The irony was indeed profound. The brother who'd demanded scientific proof had inadvertently created the conditions for that proof to be generated. His collapse during the promotion ceremony had started a chain of events that led to the kind of rigorous research that legitimized acupuncture in ways I'd never imagined possible. But perhaps the most significant change was in Marcus himself. The stress-related health issues that had caused his collapse were completely resolved, and he credited not just the initial emergency treatment, but ongoing maintenance sessions that had become part of his regular healthcare routine. "I see Dr. Wong once a month now," he explained. "Not because anything's wrong, but because I've learned to recognize when my system is getting out of balance before it becomes a crisis. It's like preventative maintenance for humans." This concept, using traditional medicine proactively rather than reactively, became another cornerstone of the expanded program. Soldiers learned to identify early signs of stress, fatigue, and other issues before they escalated into problems requiring emergency intervention. The success story reached its culmination 18 months after that dramatic day in the Fort Carson auditorium. Marcus was promoted again, this time to colonel, and asked to oversee the integration of complementary medicine programs across multiple Army installations. The ceremony took place in the same auditorium where he'd collapsed, but this time the atmosphere was celebratory rather than crisis-driven. I sat in the front row, watching my brother accept his new rank with obvious pride and genuine confidence. When the ceremony concluded without medical emergencies, Marcus sought me out in the crowd with a huge grin. "No needles required this time," he joked. "Though I have to admit I was carrying your business card in my pocket, just in case." The joke reflected how completely our dynamic had shifted. Where once Marcus had been embarrassed by my profession, he now carried my contact information as a safety net. The brother who dismissed acupuncture as useless now trusted it enough to rely on it during high-stress situations. Later that evening, at the reception celebrating his promotion, Marcus was approached by a young lieutenant who'd been struggling with combat-related stress symptoms. "Sir, I just wanted to thank you for bringing the acupuncture program to our base," the lieutenant said. "It's been life-changing for me and a lot of other soldiers." Marcus smiled and gestured toward me. "Thank my brother, Lieutenant. He's the one who saved my life and showed all of us what real healing looks like." As I watched this interaction, I realized that the most profound transformation hadn't been in military medical protocols or research validation or even public acceptance of alternative medicine. The most meaningful change had been in the relationship between two brothers who'd spent years talking past each other, each convinced that his worldview was complete. Marcus had learned that strength could manifest in forms he'd never considered, that healing traditions thousands of years old might have something valuable to offer modern medicine, and that expertise didn't always come with conventional credentials. I had learned that skepticism wasn't necessarily hostility, that scientific validation could enhance rather than diminish traditional practices, and that sometimes the people who challenge us most forcefully are the ones who ultimately help us grow the strongest. Standing in that reception hall, surrounded by soldiers whose lives had been touched by an ancient healing art, watching my brother use his influence to advocate for approaches he'd once dismissed, I felt a satisfaction that went beyond professional success. This was what Mrs. Chen had meant all those years ago, when she'd said I should always be ready to help, that I never knew when someone would need what I could give. Sometimes the person who needs help the most is the one who's been laughing at your efforts to provide it. 3 years after that life-changing moment at Fort Carson, I found myself standing in the Pentagon, briefing a room full of generals and medical directors about the nationwide implementation of what had become known as the Brennan Protocol, a comprehensive integration of traditional Chinese medicine into military healthcare systems. The name had stuck despite my protests. Marcus insisted it was appropriate since the protocol had emerged from our shared experience, but I still felt uncomfortable having a family name attached to something that represented thousands of years of accumulated wisdom from countless practitioners who would never receive recognition. The data speaks for itself, I told the assembled military leadership, clicking through slides that showed decreased pharmaceutical dependency, improved stress management scores, and significantly reduced healthcare costs across the 17 installations where the program had been implemented. We're not replacing conventional medicine, we're enhancing it with proven techniques that address root causes rather than just symptoms. General Patricia Hayes, the Army Surgeon General, leaned forward with interest. Mr. Brennan, what's been the most surprising outcome from your perspective? What did you not expect when this program began? It was a question I'd been asked variations of in dozens of interviews and presentations, but each time I answered it, new layers of meaning revealed themselves. The cultural transformation, I replied without hesitation. I expected resistance from soldiers trained to value evidence-based approaches. Instead, we found that military personnel are incredibly pragmatic. They don't care what a treatment is called or where it comes from if it works effectively and helps them perform their duties better. The real surprise had been how quickly word spread through informal military networks. Soldiers talked to soldiers, sharing experiences and recommendations in ways that no official program could have achieved. The most powerful endorsements came not from medical authorities but from tough, experienced veterans who'd found relief from problems that had plagued them for years. After the Pentagon briefing, I drove to Arlington National Cemetery to meet Marcus for our monthly lunch. It had become a tradition since his transfer to the Capitol 2 years earlier, a chance to catch up away from official responsibilities and reflect on how dramatically our lives had changed. Marcus was already waiting at our usual spot, a quiet restaurant near the cemetery where he could walk between meetings. He looked different than he had during those stressful months before his collapse. Healthier, more relaxed, carrying himself with a confidence that didn't seem forced or brittle. "How did the briefing go?" he asked as I joined him at our corner table. "They're approving full implementation across all branches of the military," I told him. "Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard. Everyone wants to adopt some version of the program." Marcus shook his head in amazement. "Do you realize what this means? In 5 years, we've gone from me collapsing on stage to acupuncture becoming standard military healthcare. That's not evolution. That's revolution." The scope of the change was indeed staggering. What had started as an emergency intervention for one stressed-out officer had become a systemic shift in how the world's most powerful military approached soldier wellness and medical care. Training programs were being established at military medical schools. Research partnerships were forming with traditional Chinese medicine universities, and young medics were learning acupuncture techniques alongside conventional emergency procedures. But the personal transformation had been equally profound. Marcus had become more than just an advocate for the program. He'd become a different kind of leader, one who valued diverse perspectives and unconventional solutions. His soldiers respected him not just for his tactical expertise, but for his openness to ideas that challenged military orthodoxy. "I got a letter from Private Williams yesterday," Marcus mentioned, referring to the young soldier from Alabama who'd been one of the program's early success stories. "He's applying to become a physician's assistant with specialization in integrative medicine. Says the acupuncture treatments he received changed his understanding of what healing could look like." Stories like Williams had multiplied across the military. Soldiers who'd experienced the benefits of traditional medicine were pursuing careers that would let them provide similar help to others. A new generation of military medical professionals was emerging, one that saw no conflict between advanced technology and ancient wisdom. The conversation turned to Mrs. Chen, my first teacher, who had passed away the previous year at the age of 94. She'd lived to see her student briefing Pentagon generals about the value of the knowledge she'd shared in her living room decades earlier. "I wish she could have seen today's presentation," I said. She always believed that traditional medicine would eventually find acceptance in Western healthcare, but I don't think even she imagined it happening quite like this. Marcus was quiet for a moment, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. You know what I think she would have said? That it happened exactly as it was meant to happen. That my collapse wasn't an accident or a failure. It was the universe creating an opportunity for healing to occur on a much larger scale. It was the kind of observation that the old Marcus would have dismissed as mystical nonsense, but the man sitting across from me had developed an appreciation for perspectives that couldn't be quantified or proven through conventional means. After lunch, we walked through Arlington National Cemetery, passing rows of white headstones that represented generations of military service and sacrifice. The contrast between this solemn reminder of war's costs and our discussion of healing innovations wasn't lost on either of us. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't collapsed that day, Marcus said, as we paused at the tomb of the unknown soldier. If I'd gotten through the ceremony without incident, would any of this have occurred? It was a question I'd pondered often. The butterfly effect of that moment seemed almost impossible to calculate. How many lives had been improved by treatments that might never have been available without that dramatic demonstration of acupuncture's effectiveness? Maybe it would have happened differently, I replied. Maybe someone else would have had a crisis that led to the same discoveries. Or maybe it took exactly what occurred, your collapse, the witnesses, the timing, to create the conditions for this kind of change. As we walked back toward the parking area, Marcus pulled out his phone to show me a video message from Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the commanding officer who'd taken over his old position at Fort Carson. She was standing in front of the base's new Integrative Medicine Center, a facility that had been built to house the expanded program. Marcus, Jake, I wanted you both to see this, Colonel Mitchell said in the video. We just completed our 1,000th successful treatment using the protocols you helped develop. But more than that, we've created a model that's being studied by medical professionals around the world. What started here at Fort Carson is now influencing healthcare approaches in civilian hospitals, veteran facilities, and military installations across 3 continents. The global reach of what we'd started was perhaps the most unexpected development of all. Medical delegations from NATO allies had visited Fort Carson to study the program. Chinese medical universities had established exchange programs with American military hospitals. The integration of Eastern and Western healing approaches that had once seemed impossible was becoming a new standard of care. But beyond the statistics and international recognition, what mattered most to me were the individual stories of healing. The veteran who'd regained feeling in his damaged leg through targeted acupuncture treatments. The military spouse who'd overcome chronic migraines that had plagued her for years. The young soldier who'd learned to manage combat stress without relying on medications that left him feeling disconnected from his emotions. Each success story represented someone whose life had been improved by knowledge that Mrs. Chen had passed down to me, knowledge that Marcus had once dismissed as worthless but had ultimately helped spread throughout the world's largest military organization. As we reached our cars, Marcus turned to me with an expression I'd learned to recognize, the look he got when he was about to say something important, but wasn't quite sure how to phrase it. Jake, I need to tell you something I should have said years ago. I was wrong about your work, obviously, but I was wrong about something deeper than that. I was wrong about the value of perspectives that didn't match my own. I spent so much time being certain about what constituted real knowledge that I almost missed the chance to learn from the wisest person I knew. It was as close to a complete apology as Marcus had ever offered, and it meant more to me than any professional recognition or program expansion could. You weren't wrong to ask questions, I told him. You were wrong to stop listening to the answers. But that changed, and look what happened when it did. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. A young man with chronic headaches had learned ancient healing techniques from an elderly neighbor. That knowledge had saved his brother's life during a moment of crisis. That crisis had opened minds and changed policies. Those changes had improved thousands of lives and shifted medical paradigms. Mrs. Chen had been right. You never know when someone will need what you can give, but she hadn't mentioned the corollary truth that I'd discovered through this experience. You never know how far the ripples will spread when you give someone exactly what they need at exactly the right moment. The brother who had once laughed at my weird hobby was now sleeping peacefully each night, his stress levels managed through techniques he'd once mocked. Thousands of soldiers were healthier and more resilient because of treatments that had once seemed foreign and suspect. And somewhere, in hospitals and clinics around the world, medical professionals were learning to bridge the gap between ancient wisdom and modern science. Sometimes the most profound changes begin with the simplest acts of healing. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.